Hey, it's your old pal Chuck Dixon back once again for another episode of Ask Chuck Dixon, where you get to ask me questions about what I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. Now, who the hell am I and why should I be answering your questions? Well, I've worked in the comic book industry for over 3 decades, writing for all the major publishers. I've written literally thousands of comic books, dozens and dozens of titles, many of which you're probably familiar with. Uh, and I'm a bit of an amateur comic book historian. I'm only an amateur because nobody pays me to do it. Uh, Comics are my first love for entertainment, and I still enjoy working in them to this day. Hey, I asked a while back, jokingly, but it's kind of turned into a feature. If people wanted to send me their dog pictures as well as questions for this channel, this is Warren Bennett's Dante. And what can you say to a picture like that then? Who's a good boy? Okay, Brad Waddell. How much input does the writer have on the big events? When they say Gotham is going to be destroyed in an earthquake, do you get told what to do, or do you get to tell whatever you want in the context of the earthquake? It's a lot of whiteboards involved back then when I was on the Batman books, particularly. Other crossovers at other companies were not handled to the painstaking degree of detail that we did at DC. And that may sound laborious, but it wasn't. It was a really enjoyable process, partly because they would take us away to these terrific resort places to hold the meetings. And, we were in the company of, a brotherhood and sometimes sisterhood of comic book creators. And generally, either Denny or one of the assistant editors would lay out the general direction of whatever Batman crossover event we were going to be involved with. And then we would begin to break it down into issues. A lot of times, particularly with Nightfall, there was a very strong spine, a strong through story with everything built into it. As far as dramatic high points and reveals and surprises and, arcs, they were all pretty much baked into Nightfall from the beginning. Later crossovers, not so much. So there was a lot more involvement in, say, Cataclysm or Contagion or Legacy from the individual writers than there had been on Nightfall. Not to say that Nightfall wasn't a fully collaborative deal, because Denny was a very flexible editor, a very hands-off editor, who was basically giving us the framework of the house, and then Doug and Alan and I were to finish it and decide where the windows went and what color the walls would be, to torture that analogy to death. But it was the job usually of Jordan Gorfinkel, sometimes Darren Vincenzo, to keep a record on many, many whiteboards. I mean, it looked like an episode of Numbers by the time the weekend was over, with whiteboards covered in graphs and sketches and all kinds of things. But, like I said, it sounds laborious, but it wasn't. It was a lot of fun. My only regret, and I'm speaking strictly of the Batman crossovers, my only regret is on some of the later, particularly Cataclysm crossovers, we didn't have as strong a through story as I would have preferred. It's certainly not as strong a spine to the story as Nightfall had, which was regrettable. As far as crossovers at other companies or crossovers with other titles, big company-wide crossovers that didn't come out of the bat offices, we were generally just given an outline and told what issues we were going to write, and it was left up to us how to deal with our issue within that crossover. It wasn't dictated to us that we were part of the story. We were sort of on the fringes of a larger story. And the higher the concept, the easier it was to write those issues. When Scott Beatty and I designed Last Laugh, a company-wide DC crossover, we thought the concept, high concept, would be a lot of fun for the other creators, because it was simply take a villain that your hero has never met and jokerize them. They've become victims of a gas that turned them into a cackling psychopath like the Joker, and we thought that was pretty elegant. Other crossovers like 1 Million and such like that were not as high concept, and kind of left you to your own devices. Over at Marvel, crossovers were not handled with the detail that they were at DC. There wasn't the kind of guidance and framework, in my experience, because I think at Marvel, a lot of the editors resented crossovers. Not all, but some. And they made their displeasure known, and the end product was somewhat indifferent because of that. Okay, next question. Pops Van Zant. What is the most important factor in choosing someone to work with or have as a guest on your show? Elbow cough. I don't have guests here. It's just me talking about me. Choosing someone to work with, well, a lot of times, you don't get a choice. They just say, hey, this guy's going to be drawing your stuff. Or would you like to work on this title? This guy's drawing it. A lot of times that was an incentive. Like, ooh, hey, we'd like you to write Nightwing, and Scott McDaniel's going to draw it. I'm like, ooh, me. Let me do that. But sometimes it comes down to capabilities and strong points and stuff like that. When I was approached to write the adaptation of Amity Schle's history of the Great Depression called The Forgotten Man, the first question that came up was, who's going to draw it? And my very, very first choice was Paul Ravoche. I only knew Paul because I had bought some original artwork from him, and we'd had a few exchanges through email, and I kind of got a sense that I liked this guy. I mean, we had, a few exchanges back and forth about comics and geeky stuff in our own careers, and I liked the exchanges, and I so I liked him, even though I'd never met him, still have not met him to this day, even though we worked together often. But he was my first choice because I thought he had the versatility. Well, I knew he did. I knew he had the versatility for a project like this, because there's a lot of different art styles involved in this, and I could write to those strengths. The other deciding factor, and it was a major one, was that Paul could draw hats. And since this was going to be set in the Great Depression, you needed a guy who could draw hats, all different kinds of hats. Now, hats may seem pretty simple, but for some artists, they're very hard to draw. I worked with an artist who was absolutely excellent in every other respect, but he could not draw hats. His hats looked like they were made out of clay. They didn't look right. They didn't look natural. As you can see from Paul's work here, he's a master at drawing hats. They're just totally integrated and totally realistic and totally authentic and totally natural. And so that was the big deciding factor, because, any artist we chose for this project was going to have to be able to draw hats. And sometimes it gets as simple as that. I mean, if you're writing a Western, you want to make sure that first off, your artist can draw hats, because hats are important in Westerns, but also that he can draw horses and natural environments. A lot of times you'll see a Western comic and nothing looks convincing. The backgrounds look like sets. The horses look like big dogs. And again, the hats look like they're not integrated into the work. Like, where did these hats come from? I hate to, keep harping on about hats, but it's one of those things. It's one of those things. It's like, you never ask an artist to draw a bicycle chase, because who wants to draw a bicycle over and over again, unless you're some sort of bicycle freak. and then sometimes you get to work with guys who are just, all rounders. Graham Nolan, I often collaborate with. He's the whole package. I mean, there's things he doesn't like to draw, but he'll draw them and draw them well, and you can't tell he didn't like to draw them. But every artist is like that. And sometimes there's very specific, there's very specific needs. In a recent project I'm doing called Seven Deadly Sinners, it's a retro throwback 1970s car chase story. There you go, sip of tea. And I needed a car guy. And to me, there's no better car guy alive than Bob C. Harden. And I had to wait years and years and years until Bob was available, and then years and years and years for him to complete the project. But as you can see here, his command of automobiles and his way of drawing them believably, integrating them into the story, turning cars even into characters in the story, it's unexcelled. Nobody is better at it than Bob Harden. And, so there wasn't even a question that couldn't do the project without him. Seven Deadly Sinners, which will be out soon from Phenom Comics. It's a throwback retro 1970s biker flick with the longest car chase ever to appear in a comic. I think literally half the graphic novel is a car chase. With multiple vehicles and extraordinarily violent. Bob had a way of taking my violent, action-packed script and making it even more gruesome than what I originally intended. But I love every page of it. And then, I get working with, pals like Sergio Cariello, who's another guy who's extraordinarily versatile. I can't think of any project that I wouldn't want to have Sergio on, that I wouldn't be perfectly happy to have Sergio on, from Bigfoot humor to superhero action to crime to whatever. I mean, the guy, he does it all. And he does it all on time. So that's another factor for choosing who you're going to work with. Can they get it done on time? Now, Bob, it sounds like I'm complaining about Bob obliquely on Seven Deadly Sinners because he took years to complete the project. But remember, it was a 110-page graphic novel. I understood he had a full-time job as an instructor at the Kubert School. And, he couldn't devote all his time to it. And I was financing it, so I wasn't paying him the highest page rate in the world either. So, part of that was a labor of love. When you see the book, you'll understand it certainly was a labor of love for both of us. Guy stats. What will be the biggest nail in the coffin for big budget superhero films? Well, if you've never lived through a trend like this, or a fad, or a phase, or a cycle like this, I have. I've lived through a number of them. TV westerns, the tail end of Davy Crockett craze, Beatlemania, Bond mania. Every other show on television for years, a couple of years was a spy show, and I don't know what will end the superhero cycle, but I assure you it will end. All these cycles end. Now, the superhero cycle's been going on for a long time. Longer, I think, than any other cycle I can remember. Longer than doctor shows. Not longer than cop shows. Cop shows are always with us. In one form or another. But, and the thing that I've learned about all of these cycles is they end overnight. They end suddenly. They end without warning. I mean, 3D comics in the 50s were selling in the millions, and then 1 month they weren't. You couldn't give them away. No one knew why. I guess the kids had reached saturation point on 3D comics. They didn't want 3D comics anymore. And I suspect that's what happens in all of these instances. People were like, okay, enough with the TV westerns. I want to watch something different. I've had my fill of spies. Let's move on. Batman, the TV show, extraordinarily popular for like a year and a half. And then the ratings just fell off a cliff. So, what do you do? in a case like that, you don't know when it's coming. And I think that's the biggest danger for the superhero cycle is that, both Disney and Warner's are up to their necks in superhero stuff. And that means that when the end comes, and you can kind of see it coming, box office and TV viewership for these things is starting to fall away a little bit. When it comes, they're going to be in production with literally dozens of television shows and probably a full slate of movies. And this is all big budget stuff. They are going to get caught with their pants down. They're going to get caught with their, butt in the door. Eventually, it's got to happen, and it'll be a debacle. So, because these cycles just simply can't go on forever, no matter how much you love them and everything else. And look, just between you and me, some of this stuff's getting a little tiresome. And that's going to be the nail in the coffin. The nail in the coffin is going to be the quality of these products. And it seems to be declining. I don't think Warner's ever found their way with the superhero stuff, the DC superhero stuff. They never found their way. Marvel did find their way for a long time, many years, and many billions of dollars at the box office. But they seem to have lost their way recently, in recent years, with phase 2 or phase whatever of the Marvel universe, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They've sort of lost the thread. For the most part, they've wandered away from the source material. And now they're doing either adapting more recent comic work that never sold to anybody, that never found an audience in comics. So why would you think it was going to find an audience on television or in movies? But, they think they know better. And there's the biggest problem both at Warner's and at Disney is they always think they know better. And they know better than you, the comic book reader. They know better than Stan Lee. They know better than Jack Kirby. They know better than Neil Adams, and all the other comic book creators that came before us. And they start winging it, and that's where the danger lies. And we can see the results in a dropping box office. Some of these films and television shows can't even get distribution in other countries, which is where they really make the money. That's a big problem for both of these studios, is if they can't get foreign distribution for this material. And of course, the more they lean into woke, the more they go broke, to complete the cliche. With the political agenda stuff, which they're very open about now, we're going to see more declining box office receipts, more declining television viewership, more pushback from fans. And again, more importantly, less foreign distribution. Because, believe it or not, most countries in the world are not interested in our woke culture. They don't understand this turn that our entertainment moguls have made toward leftist political politics and third wave feminism, or whatever this is. And they don't get it, they don't respond to it, they don't relate to it on an entertainment level. And of course, most of us don't either. Why are you changing these beloved properties to fit what you see as the norms of 2022? It's wrong to change anything to reflect the mores or beliefs or tropes or idealisms or ideologies of the current day. You don't do that. You don't update Sherlock Holmes. It's valueless unless it's kept close to its source material. If it's kept close to the attitude of the time in which it was created. And updating this stuff, that's going to be the final nail. That's what's going to hurt them more than anything else. And that's what we'll see the cycle end. If it really, seriously, if it hasn't ended already, and we're, and these properties and all are in free fall. Matthew Pack. DC used to have long-running books based on Bob Hope, Phil Silvers, and Jerry Lewis. If offered the chance to reboot any of them, would you be able to come up with an angle and make them contemporary while still maintaining the humor? If you don't know this, DC Comics published a number of celebrity-driven comics, and they published them for a really long time. I mean, these things started to appear after World War II, and they were still around when I was a kid. So Bob Hope had a long-running monthly comic at DC at the beginning, drawn by Owen Fitzgerald, comic book genius. Drew many of the issues of Bob Hope, and following that was a Jerry Lewis comic, which ran into the '60s, as you can see, and for a while, Sergeant Bilko was the #1 show on television, and had a monthly comic at DC with a spin-off comic about Private Doberman. So sales must have been terrific for them to do a spin-off. And it ran for a while with art generally by Bob Oxner, who also drew the Jerry Lewis comic, and the Dobie Gillis comic, for that matter. And Jackie Gleason had a comic for quite a while in the 50s at DC. Now, it's really funny that you ask about this, because one of my dreams is to do a Bob Hope comic book. I mean, I know it doesn't make any sense, but I'm a big fan of Hope's movies, and the challenge of doing a Bob Hope comic today, when most people don't even remember who Bob Hope was or care. But it's just, I mean, if I won the lottery, the Powerball, I would write a Bob Hope graphic novel and find somebody, I know a few people that could do it, to draw it in the style of the 50s or 60s and set it in the 50s or 60s. And come up with a storyline and all the rest of it, because there's the classic Hope movies all ran along the same line, and Hope's screen persona of the braggadocious coward, I just love that character. Now, if you don't know who Bob Hope was, Bob Hope for a long time was the #1 celebrity personality in America. He was big in movies. He was big in television. He wrote best-selling books. He was huge on radio. He was just enormously popular. He was a fixture in American entertainment for a really long time, and a funny guy with an impeccable sense of timing, and had an army of writers who would write wise-ass remarks for him. And it would just be fun. There'd be no other reason. Probably 5 people would buy it. but I would get to say I wrote a Bob Hope comic. Daniel Farmer, would you return to the Transformers Hearts of Steel world? And if so, what ideas would you like to use, or directions you'd take it? I worked on this at IDW. I worked on it 2 different times. I worked on Transformers, and they were set in, I hate the term steampunk, but they were set in that era. They were set in the late 1800s. And they were a lot of fun to write, but a little scary too, because I knew when I worked at Marvel, I learned from the editors and writers there that the Transformer fans were probably more rabid fans, and I mean that in a polite and complimentary sense. They were more rabid fans even than Doctor Who fans. I mean, they were very jealous of the franchise they loved. Jealous. By jealous, I mean in guarding it, like you would guard a child of your own. Transformer fans are like the most loyal fans. They're the pickiest fans, and I'm not saying this in any way as an insult. I mean, we've all seen franchises we love torn apart or deteriorate or ruined by people who didn't care. But Transformers fans get, just short of militant about it. If you betray the, core, source material of the Transformers, or you try to change it in any way or alter it beyond recognition, or write it indifferently, they're going to call you on it. And they're going to call you all in one voice because they all seem in agreement. Every Transformers fan seems to have it's not their own image. It's like a shared image of what this universe is, what the character relationships are, how it should be portrayed. I got a lot of respect for that. I really do. As a Star Wars fan, former Star Wars fan, lapsed Star Wars fan, I understand it. I understand it. You don't want to see this thing that you love, go to hell. So I had that in mind when I wrote Transformers: Heart of Steel and the one other thing I did in the arena. And so I did a lot of reading on it because I wasn't that familiar with the franchise. It was kind of after my time toy wise, and before the time for my kids. So I had no real exposure to it in the real world, other than seeing them on the racks at the toy department. So I did a lot of reading, and I was aided by the fact that it was set in the past. That it was sort of set in almost like a pocket universe within the greater Transformer continuity. But I always thought, well, it's in continuity. To me, it's in continuity, and I treated it that way. And I learned about the different characters and their characteristics and all the rest of it. And the relationship between the Transformers and the Decepticons and all that back history. And, and then I just had fun. Once I did the research, I just had fun. And I, put in a lot of historical characters and sometimes mythic historical characters. I mean, I managed to fit in Jules Verne and Mark Twain, and stuff like that, and put it in a real historical perspective of why the Transformers were there and what they were doing and all the rest of it. And of course, I was aided and abetted by terrific artists who came up with these tremendous interpretations of in-period Industrial Revolution era Transformers. I love those wooden barrel shoulder boards there. But yeah, it was fun, and yeah, I'd go back to it. I don't know where I would take it. You want to stay away from World War One because Transformers in World War One be kind of trivializing. But maybe I don't know. I don't know where I would take it. But I could come up with something. Find some, maybe something like an Antarctic exploration or something that uncovers some horrible secret that the Decepticons don't want revealed yet. Whatever. I'm already writing the story. See, this is how it works. Eric Morin. I'm enjoying the Bad Times books. What kind of prep did you do for this series of novels? I read a lot. A lot, years and years, many years of reading, and a lot of history, a lot of historical fiction, a lot of military stuff. And so when I'm doing the Bad Times books are available on Amazon. It's a series so far of 6 books. It's about a group of former U.S. Army Rangers who become involved in the time travel experiment. And then they make a lot of trouble for themselves going back in time and kicking things around. And they visit places like Paris during the Franco-Prussian War. They visit Roman Judea. They visit Nevada, 100,000 years in the past, prehistoric Nevada. Things like that. And an enormous... they visit the Taiping Rebellion, which was the world's bloodiest war up until World War One. And I'll use that as an example. I mean, I did the Taiping Rebellion because I didn't want to do a time travel series where they go back and they land on the Titanic, where they're there at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. I didn't want to visit historical events that everybody knew about. I wanted to visit more obscure historical events that most people weren't aware of. And I knew from the beginning of the series I wanted to get to the Taiping Rebellion. And because I had read a book years before called God's Other Son. And it was about the Taiping Rebellion. It was this big, thick history book on the Taiping Rebellion, and the rebellion was a guy in China in the early 1800s. He failed as a was a failed civil servant. He tried to become a civil servant under the Qing dynasty, and he failed all the tests, and this made him a little bit nuts. And he began to believe that he was the brother of Jesus Christ. He was God's other son. And he created a cult about himself that eventually grew to an army. And I mean an army of millions. And he began to take over cities. And of course, the Chinese emperor and his family weren't too pleased about this. And also foreign entities who were involved in China at the time, England, France, Russia, they weren't happy about it either. And as I said, it was the bloodiest war in human history before World War One. I mean, tens of millions of people died. It literally changed the map of China. And we're still feeling the repercussions today of what happened during the Taiping Rebellion. And so, I thought, what a perfect setting for basically what is a military action series, which is what Bad Times, at the heart of it is. It's Bad Times sort of it's my toy soldier fantasy series, where it's like, well, what if? It's like alternate history without altering history, because I don't, I don't. There are some visits to parallel dimensions where the timeline has been changed, but for the most part, I insert my characters into real historical events that I've researched as best I can and try to make as believable and understandable as I can. And of course, all of that leads to, action and fighting and shooting and running around. So if you like time travel stories and high action, high adventure entertainment, go over there to Amazon and check out my series Bad Times. Josh, Labes or Labs? You must get that all the time. Hey, I have to spell my last name for everybody I meet. Okay. Why are good interior artists so rare these days? Well, part of it's money. DC and Marvel are not paying the rates they used to, and a lot of artists find that they can either make more money working independently on their own projects or simply doing commissions, which is the saddest development ever in comics. That really terrific artists, his top flight, best guys in the business, are not actually working on comic books. They're drawing commissions for fans, which is, that's great for the fan, and it's great for the artist, because they're getting paid to do what they do, but the rest of us don't get to enjoy it, and it's not actual comics. It's just, pinups, which is sad. So these two things combine, the money and the greater opportunities. And in some cases, artists have either been blacklisted or left of their own accord because they don't like what's going on at DC and Marvel. And that leaves us with bad art when you get what you pay for. And, your talent pool shrinks to the less talented. Who will work for that, horrible page rate. Maybe they live with their mom and dad. Maybe their spouse has a good job and they can afford to work at DC and Marvel. But for the most part, bad interior art, and there was bad interior art when I was working at the Big Two, and this was during the 90s when page rates were crazy. And royalties were crazy, and the money was really good. But they still hired people that weren't very good at comics. Part of it was because there were a lot of comics being published. You couldn't always get the best guy, so you had to hire who you could get. But the larger part of it was that most comic book editors then and now, they didn't know good art if they fell over it. You had editors who would literally look through Wizard magazine to see who was hot, and who was hot wasn't necessarily who was good. and they would hire people that were not ready for prime time. And and the other thing is they would everything had to be rushed into production all the time, particularly at Marvel. So you had artists who were good but weren't given time enough to show that. Everything was a rush job. Everything was last minute, and that hurts. And I don't know if that's what's going on today. But I look at the art on a lot of comics out of Marvel and DC, and I think, if you gave this person all the time in the world, they still couldn't draw a convincing building or car or a human face reflecting any kind of emotion we recognize. So yeah, that's the story on interior art. Lou Avery, thoughts on the Stargate shows? Well, I like them. I watched them all, except the last one. I dug the first one, military action. Actually, I preferred Stargate Atlantis. I liked Stargate SG-1 a whole lot, but I just preferred Stargate Atlantis. I really dug the cast. They were a lot of fun, and I thought that they had a really cool chemistry. And what I liked about these shows is they weren't afraid to have humor now and then. It wasn't straight up grim, sci-fi adventure. It wasn't apocalyptic in any way, and they kept things flowing. And for a syndicated show, it had good effects. And they knew how to use them. They knew how to not push it too far. Yes, it got a little tired when they were obviously running through the same forests in British Columbia every week, but you had to understand it's not a show you want to binge watch because after a while you get to recognize some of the trees. But you had to understand that there just wasn't the budget for full blown alien landscapes. But I enjoyed it, all except Stargate Universe, the last series, which for some reason got no sense of humor, got very grim and depressing, and I couldn't tell where the hell any of it was going, and I couldn't get, despite an excellent cast of actors, I couldn't get engaged with the characters. Just an utter misstep, in my opinion. But for straight up, sci-fi military action, there isn't a better television show, if that's what you're looking for. Kurt Anthony Krug or Krug. Man, I'm having a tough time with the last names here. Sorry, everybody. Since Moon Knight is hot due to this show, why did you leave this title? Yeah, well, when I first took on Moon Knight, I was invited by Carl Potts. He was an editor at Marvel at the time, and he liked the work that I had done on his Alien Legion series. I mean, liked it very much. I mean, whenever he has an Alien Legion comics project, he always turns to me, hey, you want to write it? It's like, he doesn't consider anybody else, which it's very flattering. Because, I mean, he and Frank Scirocco created the property, and he always trusted me with it. So he hired me to do Moon Knight, and the conceit on this series was going to be a monthly series. It was going to be called Mark Spector Moon Knight, as it was. And the conceit was that we were going to get rid of the other conceit of Mark Spector and his two other personalities. So Moon Knight was no longer going to be schizophrenic. He wasn't going to be Sybil anymore. He was just going to be Mark Spector, who was a former mercenary. And at the time, mercenaries were hot. Everybody was writing about mercenaries. There were, best-selling mercenary paperback series and things like that. So mercenaries were in the news and interesting, and I thought, oh yeah. And Carl said, you'll do the homework on the military stuff, and you have an understanding of that genre. And I thought, well, this is cool. A superhero with a military background and a history, the sort of dark gray area, shadowy past that a mercenary would have, that a soldier of fortune would have. So you had a built-in cast of enemies and stuff like that. And so, I started writing, and I wrote for I think the first 12 issues, and then Carl moved on to something else, and I was given another editor. And now Carl was a hands-off editor. He would make suggestions and then let you go. He was a former assistant editor to Denny O'Neil and learned well under that man's tutelage. to pick the right people for the job and then leave them alone to do the best they can. Well, the new editor was the other kind of editor who wants to ask for rewrites, make suggestions, change dialogue, all kinds of things. And I got the impression after a while that this new editor was trying to make life as hard as possible for me so that I would quit. And we came to a crux point when he was telling me about a television show he had watched the night before. And he wanted me to do something like that in Moon Knight. And I said, well, okay, I can, there's like this gimmick on the show that, I could work that into a future story. And he said, no, I want you to rewrite the script you just handed in to include that gimmick. And I said, so you want to write a script that I've handed in, I've already been paid for, and I won't get paid for again. and totally rewrite that script based on something you saw on television last night. A script I handed in weeks ago. But you want me to make changes based on something you saw on TV last night. And I said, I won't do it. And he says, well, you have to do it because I'm telling you to. And he goes, well, if you want to fire me, but I won't do it. And because for number one, I'm not getting paid. Secondly, I said I would use your gimmick in a future issue. I thought that was being flexible and cooperative. But I'm not going to, do this kind of rewriting on the fly for no purpose. It serves no purpose. It doesn't make the script I handed in any better. And I'm not going to do it. So if you want to fire me, fire me. And he said, well, I'm not going to fire you. And I said, well, I know you want me to leave the book. I just laid my cards on the table. But I'm not going to leave because I'm enjoying writing this title despite, the hoops you're having me jump through. And I won't, I'm not going to leave. So Jerry Lewis made an appearance there. So it was maybe another 6 issues before he worked up the nerve to can me. So that's why I left the title. I didn't want to, but I wrote 2 years, 24 issues, and I'm happy with them. I thought it was a good run, and it was kind of a practice run for me writing Batman because I created a young sidekick for him and stuff like that. So I mean, let's face it, Moon Knight's always been Marvel's Batman, although Moon Knight really doesn't live up to that level. He's not really Marvel's Batman. He's Marvel's Batman wannabe. But it was good practice nonetheless to write this kind of, billionaire character. He had a chauffeur instead of a butler. I mean, it's all the same setup as Batman, but it's Moon Knight. Dave Donovan. Why have war comics died as a genre unless they're written by Garth Ennis? He used to be a staple of comics. Well, yeah, they did. If you don't know this about war comics were a big deal, particularly at DC. But they sold well at Marvel as well. But at DC, they were hugely successful. With Sergeant Rock and a whole bunch of other titles. I mean, the war comics at DC, they had 5 titles from the 50s into the 70s, 5 monthly titles at a time when Superman and Batman combined only had 4. So that gives you an indication of how well these books did. And throughout the 50s, they were anthology titles. They didn't feature recurring characters or anything like that. So these were selling to a slightly older audience, particularly if you read, and every company had war comics, but DC are like, that's the bar. If you were either better or worse than a DC comic. DC's was the bellwether for war comics, and they sold to a slightly older audience. If you read DC war comics from the 50s, and then you read other output from DC in the 50s, you see that special care was being taken on those war books to make them a bit more mature, a better structured, a lot less ridiculous than the superhero titles. there's not a lot of contrivance. There's an effort to tell good stories. They are solid entertainment that an adult might read. So a lot of effort was put into it. And, as I said, all the way into the 70s, these were top-selling titles for them. Particularly in the 70s, Sergeant Rock and GI Combat were selling far better than the superhero titles. And in general, the war genre has always been a big part of comics. Every company had them. Atlas had, it'd be pre-Marvel, had dozens of war titles. I mean, they relied on the war titles to keep the company alive through the 50s. That and romance titles. So yeah, it's a big, vibrant, important part of comics history. It's kind of forgotten now. And it's funny that you say only Garth Ennis gets to write war comics. That's almost a policy. In fact, at DC, it was the policy. One of my Batman editors told me that a new editor had taken over the war titles at DC, and he had plans, because up till then they did a Sergeant Rock special now and then, or something like that, or a reprint book. But this new editor had plans. He was going to bring back some of the old DC war characters, and that I should go talk to him, since I liked writing that kind of stuff. And so I went to see this editor, and he, literally told me that only under his aegis, only Garth Ennis would be allowed to write war comics. He was very pleased to tell me that I would not be writing any war comics at DC. Only Garth Ennis could. Now, nothing against Garth. I mean, he writes a hell of a war comic, but this policy at DC kind of spread everywhere, so that when even independent publishers came up with ideas for war comics, it was like, only Garth Ennis can write war comics. It's like there wasn't anyone else in the business that would do the homework and all the rest of it. And this isn't a policy that Garth endorsed, I'm certain. Reading Garth's introductions to British war comic anthologies, I get the understanding this guy really digs war comics, really likes war comics, and probably would welcome a lot more war comic books, not written by him. I mean, I think, Garth and I both would like to see a resurgence of interest in the war genre in comics, because, it sells to a different audience. Comics are a great medium for telling military history and war action, and it's a shame there isn't more of it. Although, there is stuff being done. There's an excellent book, hardcover graphic novel called Dogs of War, about canines, and it shows 3 different periods in history, and it's an excellent book. As you can see, the art's terrific, storytelling is fantastic, very moving, and apparently sold very well. And there's a lot of war titles. If you go on Amazon and you look for war comics, there's a lot of recent comics being done, sometimes by foreign publishers, sometimes by American publishers. But there's a lot of interest in this genre still. And as far as me writing war comics, I do a series called Medal of Honor. These are free digital comics on AUSA, the Association of the United States Army. We've done 16 of these, some of them with top comics talent on the artwork, and I've written all of them. And they retell the stories of U.S. Army soldiers, and in one case, a U.S. Army nurse, who were awarded our nation's highest honor. And these are 8-page comics. Eventually, they assure me these will be reprinted in a retail graphic novel edition, but I don't know all the plans on that. But if you go to AUSA.com and look for Medal of Honor, you can read all of these comics for free there. So I'm still kicking in the war genre. And I do have another war-oriented graphic novel coming out soon, but I can't talk about it yet. But I promise you, when you hear about it, it'll blow your mind. And the art's coming along and looks absolutely gorgeous. So yeah, I'm still in the war genre because I love it. It other than westerns, it's probably my favorite genre to write comics in. Allie Hanley, sorry, boy, I am blowing it today. What needs to happen in the entire comics? What needs to happen in the entire comics industry to be relevant? Well, relevancy is kind of the problem, because relevancy is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, what's important to one person ideologically or culturally isn't important to others. And as we've learned from the big comic book companies, the editors and creators at primarily DC and Marvel, but also at some of the indies, their worldview is not shared by the vast majority of the reading audience, who are not thrilled or charmed or diverted by any of the material that they're creating. So they've left behind a vast number of readers who simply say, these comics aren't for me. They're obviously not created for me. And if I'm following social media, I learn through posts from the editors and creators that they don't even want me reading them. They want me to go away. And of course, tens of thousands have gone away. So how do you get readers back? The other aspect is that by leaving the newsstand, making comics less visible as part of our culture, they have skipped a generation of readers. So we have an entire generation, possibly two, or coming up on two generations of readers who were never exposed to comics, have no interest, would never pick a comic book up. A comic book is, as alien to them as an 8-track tape would be. And so they just simply have no interest. So how do you get them interested? Well, Marvel has taken a step, and I'm sure it's not a conscious step. It's a money grab. They're doing a Spider-Man crossover with Fortnite. They can go, you can be all cynical about it and everything else, but it's actually, whether they meant it to be or not, it's a brilliant move, marketing-wise and everything else, because you're bringing Spider-Man into an already enormously popular gaming franchise. And I'm sure anytime you do a crossover, and this is a crossover, both sides of the crossover go, what's in it for me? And the Fortnite people must have just thought, hey, we're going to have fun with Spider-Man, because there's really nothing in it for us. We're not bringing, millions of Spider-Man readers over to Fortnite, because there aren't millions of Spider-Man readers. And Marvel must have thought, ka-ching, because we're getting to put our guy into an arena where, that literally hundreds of millions of people enjoy worldwide. Maybe some of these, Fortnite players, well, they won't be seeing Spider-Man for the first time, but they'll be exposed to Spider-Man in a way outside of the movies, in a way they hadn't before. Now, this leads me to my game plan of how you would bring comics back into the center of pop culture, or regain interest from the general public in comics. And that is by publishing comics that spark curiosity, that a comic you gotta have, the comic that would make you curious about it. Now, making a character gay or killing a character and bringing them back obviously doesn't work anymore. If it ever did. After Superman's death, none of those deaths had an impact, you know what I mean? And now they've turned every character bi, gay, or asexual. So, that's not going to sell any comics. It might get you news coverage. It might get people arguing on Facebook and Twitter, but it's not going to sell one comic book. You got to get a comic book people are going to go, whoa, I want to check that out. Or I'm curious. Or I would pick that up. Okay? And I'm going to give this idea away to the comic book industry. And trust me, they won't listen, because it involves a hassle and a lot of work. But the secret to making comics relevant again, at least in the initial stages, is crossovers. Comics can cross over characters that no other medium can do it in. And comic book editors and publishers hate to hear about crossovers because they involve lawyers. And you got to get lawyers and copyright issues and everything else. But I'm sorry, you can take almost any franchise, mash it together with another franchise, and you're going to come up with a comic book somebody wants to read. You wouldn't want to read Nightmare on Elm Street meets Predator? Of course you would. I don't care how silly it got. You would want to read that. Okay? Harry Potter, Doctor Strange, make it happen. Disney, Warner's, get your act together. DC, Marvel, propose this tomorrow. Who wouldn't want to read? This comic would sell 500,000 copies. If you got it in front of kids, if you put a graphic novel of this at a book fair, because look, these two franchises are huge. You put them together at a book fair, children's book fair, sell out. I guarantee it. But again, it's a lot of work. Alien, G.I. Joe. Yeah. I'd write that in a heartbeat. I'd read that in a heartbeat. I'd pick it up even if the art was crap just to see what happened. Do you feel me? Do you hear me? Am I making any sense here? Of course I am. These are comics. I mean, recently read about Bruce Campbell doing a Sergeant Rock zombie graphic novel. And I'm like, yeah. It's the first time literally in 20 years that I saw a DC comic that I would want to read. And, yeah, okay, I love Sergeant Rock. But still, the combination of Bruce Campbell, Sergeant Rock, and zombies, I mean, come on. Now, maybe that's not a comic that kids would like, but Aliens meet Snake Eyes? Yeah, that's a comic kids would like. Kids would pick that up. Because if nothing else, it's going to be a bloodbath. Oh, you're going to want to read this one. Maybe they get Garth Ennis to write it. Okay. What's you reading? Well, what am I reading? I read this terrific biography of Charles Addams. Charles Addams, A Cartoonist's Life by Linda H. Davis. And Ms. Davis did just an exhaustive amount of research, meeting relatives and friends of Charles Addams who are still around, and reading letters and journals, and seeing, I envied her for this, seeing hundreds of cartoon pitches that weren't accepted, like gags that he had done that the New Yorker didn't buy. Now, if you don't know who Charles Addams is, Addams was, obviously most famous for creating the Addams Family, but he was a New Yorker cartoonist primarily, but he did a lot of advertising work and things like that. But he was grew up in New Jersey, and as a young man, did a lot of artwork, wanted to be a cartoonist or illustrator, and he was at the right age when the New Yorker came along, and he sort of grew up with it, and he aimed himself like a guided missile at, I want to work at the New Yorker, and he did, and he worked there for decades, and extremely successful, with this sort of like grim, macabre sense of humor. But he was a genius at layout and stuff like that. And in the book tells us of his life and all the his working process and everything else. And I got a lot out of that because he wasn't just a cartoonist; he was a writer as well, because he would have to come up with these gags. And what I learned in the book was that he actually bought gags, or New Yorker would buy gags and give them to him. But I've seen examples, not in the book, but examples of how he would take one of these gags and just transform it and make it his own, make it a lot funnier than it was initially, just by his composition and layout and the rest of it. But he had a dry sense of humor. He lived up to the reputation that people would tell stories about him that made him sound like a psychotic recluse, made him sound close to the characters that were in his cartoon. And of course, he would never correct them on these because he wanted this mystique about himself. But he was, apparently a very, gentle dude, well liked by, everybody, a funny guy to be around. His dark sense of humor extended to his real life. He would sometimes laugh at funerals. I mean, he was just that kind of guy. The book also gets a lot into his personal life, which I usually don't find interesting, but whoa, his personal life. He lived like this cartoonist dream life where he was well known, well paid, and well regarded, and famous. And he was famous personally. and he hung out with a lot of the literati, and he was also a bit of a philanderer. He was married 3 times, but he famously had affairs with Greta Garbo, uh, and Jacqueline Kennedy, and Joan Fontaine. My jaw dropped at them. It's like, yeah, this guy got around, uh, and he was a cartoonist. It was a different age then when a cartoonist could get that kind of respect. But he liked fast cars, and he liked creepy houses and all the rest of it. The book also gets into the creation of the television show The Addams Family, which made Addams even more of a household name than he already was from the cartoons. And it talks about how much a part of the creation of the show he was. His contract said that he had no say over final scripts, but he did work with the producers and the cast to give them a better idea of who these characters were. Because remember, these characters had appeared in gag cartoons, just spot cartoons, so there wasn't a lot of background on them. Who are they? It reached a point where he even had to name them. And he gave John Astin picked the name Gomez because Addams had 2 names for this character. I can't remember the other one. It was like Redondo or Represso or something like that. And Astin said, I like Gomez. Wednesday's name was picked by a toy company who made a doll of her earlier. Adam's name Fester and Lurch, and Pugsley's name was originally Pubert, but the producer said that sounded dirty. And if you remember the second Addams Family movie, they worked that line into the movie. Pubert being a filthy name. So he had a lot of involvement, and he wrote these wonderful essays on who these characters were, their aspirations, their wants, what they were like, and descriptions of the kind of things they would do. And all of the actors, took it very seriously, particularly John Astin. Astin was made suggestions to Addams about sword fighting and things like that, where the Addams fortune had come from, and all the rest of it. And so there was a lot of back and forth at the beginning, and I found it fascinating because I loved this show when I was a kid, and I loved Addams's cartoons. On a side note, sadly, because the New Yorker looked down on television and looked down on this television show in particular with such disdain, they would not allow Addams to portray the Addams Family in the New Yorker cartoons going forward. So once the show aired, there were no more Addams Family cartoons appearing in New Yorker, although Addams managed to slyly slip in Wednesday and Fester and characters like that in the backgrounds of some of the cartoons. And apparently the editors either let it go or they didn't notice it. But sadly, we got no more actual Addams Family cartoons out of Charles Addams once the TV show showed up. So, hey, if you want to contact me, if you have questions, suggestions, dog pictures, Dante, what a good boy. You send them to brunobookstore@gmail.com, brunobookstore@gmail.com. It's the most reliable way to reach me. And I read them all. You can also reach me on many, many other sites if you can find them. I'm all over the place. I'm just a social media whore. That's all there is to it. The next thing I want to talk to you about while I gotcha is Hunter Ninja Bear. Hunter Ninja Bear is a 360-page graphic novel that I wrote, Mel Ruby drew, Rob Hunter inked, and Ivan Nunez colored. And it's available through Phenom Comics through a Kickstarter campaign. And I will have the link here below the video to the Hunter Ninja Bear Kickstarter. And it's a big ass period piece set in the early 1800s. It travels from Japan at the Tokugawa period to the United States, the Pacific Northwest, as a clan of ninja who are in hiding from the emperor. living as farmers at the foot of Mount Fuji, in the forests at the foot of Mount Fuji, are plagued by a pack of man-eating, man-killing bears. And these aren't the usual cuddly bears you see in Japan. This is a species of grizzly-sized killers. And the ninja, master killers themselves, are only good at killing men. They're not equipped to go after this pack of bears. And so one of them sails to the United States in search of hunters, professional hunters. And he returns to Japan with a pack of wild mountain men, and carnage ensues. It's, as I said, it's a 360-page graphic novel. It's on Kickstarter, and the important thing for you to know is it's completed. You're not going to have to put your money in Kickstarter and wait 10 years for us to finish this graphic novel. It is completed. Every page is drawn, lettered, colored. There's been preview copies printed. So it is a real thing, so that once the campaign is over, fulfillment will swiftly follow on its heels with all the extras and tchotchkes and stretch goals or anything else. So if you follow the link below to go to Kickstarter and look for Hunter Ninja Bear, and it's $30 for a 360-page graphic novel. I think that's a deal, and it's a cool thing. If you haven't checked out My Sister Suprema yet, it's doing very well over on ArcTunes, so you might want to head over there. I'll provide a link here as well. Anthony Gonzalez Clark and I are having a blast working on My Sister Suprema, and we're getting a good reaction from a lot of readers, so it might be something you might enjoy taking a look at. So anyway, that's it for me this week. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you hit the subscribe button, I appreciate that. If you sent me some that super chat money, I don't know. There's some sort of thing where you can super thank me with a few shekels. That's appreciated as well. And as always, I will see every one of you down the road.